Breaking news, another tragedy at another American high school.
The shooting happened yesterday morning at Appalachian High School in Winder. That's roughly 45 miles northeast of Atlanta.
2 students and 2 teachers were killed and 9 people were wounded. A 14-year-old student has been arrested in the shooting. Law enforcement had been previously warned about the suspect.
In a statement, the FBI says it received several anonymous tips about an online threat to commit a school shooting last year.
The sheriff's office interviewed a boy and his father, but found no probable cause to take any additional action.
This suspect's aunt told you, and I'm quoting here, he was begging for help from everybody around him. The adults around him failed him.
Hi, everyone. This is Ken Feudernick, the host of Courageous Conversations about our schools. Just a few days ago, I interviewed Haley Watson, a clinical psychologist who specializes in conflicts like bullying that occur among young people. One day after our interview, a 14-year-old student at Appalachian High School in Winder, Georgia, walked onto a campus with a military-style rifle and killed 2 other 14-year-old students and 2 math teachers. He also injured at least 8 others before he was taken into custody. Given the nature of my conversation with Dr. Watson about the effects of childhood trauma and bullying and the need for mental health support in the classroom, I thought, I've got to have her back. So Haley, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a really pleasure to be here and so important to be talking about this topic. So thank you.
Yeah, so I'm eager to hear, what were your thoughts both personally and professionally when you heard this news?
Well, I mean, it's devastating every time one of these situations happens, and it's terrible that it's a one of these times kind of a comment, because this isn't, of course, the only incident like this. Personally, I feel so sad for everyone involved in this. Obviously the victims and everyone at that school, and also the shooter, to be in such a state of despair that this seemed like a good choice to make. That's devastating to me. So personally, I guess those are the feelings that come up. And of course, then the fear that everyone else feels, that we all feel as parents in, living in the US, that this could happen to one of our children. And then professionally, it really just reinforces my personal passion for the work that I do in terms of prevention, and how do we get on the front foot of this, and how do we make sure that more kids have access to more resources and more coping strategies so they don't turn to these levels of violence.
Haley, I was struck by your acknowledging the pain that the shooter, Colt Gray is his name, and the pain that he must have been feeling prior to this. I think our reaction when someone does something like this is to, I remember hearing that the sheriff who was involved and first went in there, he referred to the situation as evil has entered our school building. And it's almost, we don't even want to humanize this and think of a 14-year-old boy as being human. But your reaction was, it's hard to say. My heart goes out to someone who must have been in that much pain. But I wonder if we don't do that, and if we just treat this as pure evil, then it doesn't lead us to the kinds of solutions that we need to think about to prevent this.
Exactly. And I think the distinction is the act can be considered pure evil, or whatever language you want to use, destructive, horrible, all of those things. The actions are in no way, shape, or form okay at all. But the person that does the action, and this is true of any human being doing any action, there's always a person behind that. And I think the most important question in a situation like this is why? Why would someone do that? And if we just blanket say, well, that person's evil, and put them in a category of, the bad apple kind of analogy, one bad apple in the middle of all of these good apples, then we never can prevent the next one because we don't have the whole story behind it. And when you think about, to be in a state of mind to kill someone, that is a scary state of mind. And so what are all the factors that lead to that? And how do we start to recognize and prevent that? Notice when it's happening, give students tools and skills to be able to make different choices so they don't end up in such a scary state of mind.
The conversation inevitably went right to gun controls and gun regulations, and that debate happens every single time there is a shooting. And
Yeah.
I suppose it's a necessary debate. It doesn't seem like things change very much. But what people on the left and the right seem to agree on is that we do have to provide much more support for families and for kids who are suffering from mental health challenges. I read, I think it was within a day of the shooting, that Colin Gray's aunt said that he had been struggling and desperate for mental health support for some time before this, and apparently didn't get it. And I'm wondering, did the system fail him in some way? What can you say about kids who across the country may be suffering like he was, and probably obviously still is, and wasn't able to get mental health support?
And I think it's a really important point. And speaking generally, I don't know the exact specifics, and I think most of us don't know the exact specifics of this school. So it's helpful to kind of look at it globally or more generally. But this is a really common occurrence where there are young people. And one of the things that struck me when I was reading up about it is the student who he was sitting next to in class, and he got up to leave class. And her comment was, oh, he leaves class all the time. He's often absent. To immediately, that's a red flag. If a student is absent, leaving class, not engaged in class, that is always a sign that there's something going on, whether it's that they don't feel like they belong at the school, whether it's that they're struggling with things at home, whether it's that the school is, the work is really difficult and they're struggling with it. There's always going to be a reason if a student isn't showing up. And then on top of this, I read that same report. It sounds like he was actively asking for help, or his family was asking for help for him. There are so many things, and I was reading a little bit about his background, and his family faced a lot of challenges. He was going through a lot of things, and so he would have needed support. And I think the problem and the way the system often fails kids like this is that there aren't enough practitioners to service all of the needs of every single student in a school system. Simply, there isn't the funding for that, there isn't the access for that. But it's also a problem that we're only focused on trying to identify kids that are in the worst situation and then provide reactive support. So we really need to be focusing on prevention. So every single student in every single school across the US should be learning tools for coping with strong feelings and traumatic experiences and hard situations. They should be able to talk to more people than just the school counselor. They should know how to reach out for help. These are skills we need to be teaching them. And that's why I think the system is failing, because we're much too focused on the reaction and not enough focused on the prevention.
So we talked a bit about this in our previous interview about specific things educators can do, but what I was struck by is your belief and your experience working with classroom teachers in helping them do exactly what you're describing. They don't have to be trained mental health professionals. There's a lot they can do to prevent the kinds of things that we're talking about. And I think your point is such a good one. We say, what can we do when a red flag goes up and there's a crisis? And yes, there should be responses. And there should be people available. And that probably requires investments in professionals. But what you're talking about is something that can happen right now without necessarily investing huge sums of money to prevent more of this kind of thing from happening. Just say a little bit for our listeners that may not have heard the first interview, what a teacher might be able to do to get kids who are struggling emotionally and in terms of their mental health to to begin to deal with those feelings in better ways?
So I think the first thing is it's really important that teachers have resources they can use, because it is a really big burden to all of a sudden ask a teacher to say, you now need to be teaching mental health skills when that's not an area you're trained in. So making sure you have a resource tool. Again, there are a number that you can use, but making sure that you have, a set curriculum that you're following. But at a really simple sense, the skills that students need to learn that teachers can teach are really human skills. How do I communicate my feelings? How do I identify what I need in a moment? How do I communicate when I'm having a challenge in a peer group? How do I set a boundary in a peer group? How do I recognize when something's happening that's not okay with me? These are quite complex skills, but actually can be broken down into really simple tools and strategies. And again, that's where a resource really comes in handy. But if we start this really young, we can start these kinds of skills when kids are 3 and 4 and 5 years old, and then we regularly continue through their whole schooling, their whole education. If they're practicing this skill just the same way as we know that kids become literate because they have they take English class and they take it every year and they practice and they practice, and when students are falling through the cracks, we make sure they have extra practice, but we have this baseline of skill building. That's the same thing that we need with mental health. And so teachers can use resources and teach these things quite easily when they have the right tools. But districts also need to be prioritizing it in terms of, we need a class. There needs to be a mental health class where students are learning this. And that needs to go from pre-K through to grade 12. And that's really, really important and vital, because if we want prevention to be, at the forefront, we can't just expect teachers to do it in the middle of all of their other teaching. It needs to be a dedicated class time.
Let me shift gears just a little bit. One of the things that I read in the last few days after this horrific event took place is that Colt's father, who's now been charged with several serious crimes, said that his son was getting picked on in school. And he goes on to say that other students just ridiculed him day after day after day. All of us that went through school remember that there were kids got picked on. Some of us got picked on. We may have picked on other kids, but when kids get bullied and it's frequent and it's targeted and intentional, can that lead people to become violent? And B, can schools do anything about it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So if you just even imagine being in a situation where everybody in your life is cruel to you and rude to you and disregards you, and you don't have connection and belonging, and you don't have a support system, just even imagine that reality. As an adult, it's devastating and terrifying. Now, imagine being a child and experiencing that, where you don't have any perspective of knowing that it's ever going to change. That is so scary and devastating. And that's what leads kids, unfortunately, to suicide. It also can lead kids to extreme violence like this. So again, there's always going to be a lot of factors at play. So there's going to be things going on at home, et cetera, as well. But being chronically bullied is a very, very disturbing experience. And so absolutely, it can lead to these kinds of thoughts and sadly, these kinds of actions. And so what can schools do? Again, of course, we need, the reactive approach in terms of when bullying is happening. There needs to be, interventions in place. There needs to be ways to support those students that are experiencing this, ways to encourage different behavior, and all of those things need to be in place. But also there needs to be the prevention. So again, we need to be teaching students the skills of, how do I notice when someone is saying something that's hurtful? How do I speak up about that? How do I communicate that? How do I recognize if I'm the one picking on someone? How do I recognize the impact that that's truly having? Because so many of these times there'll be one kid who probably is experiencing challenges at home as well, who is, specifically picking on someone and they're lashing out. And then there's lots of other kids that are following along because they would never do that themselves, but they're also not standing up to it because they're wanting to fit in and they're worried about peer pressure and all those kinds of things. So how do we teach all students the skill set to recognize, how do I be someone that stands up against this? And how do I protect people that are vulnerable? And how do I, navigate this situation? It's a skill set and we have to teach it.
Yeah, and of course, there's another aspect to this problem that I would love to hear your thoughts about, and that is the impact of these events on several groups of people. One, there's the immediate school community, the kids that were in the classroom, the kids that were at the school, their families. I just cannot imagine the trauma that they're experiencing being so close to it. But then you have the nearby people in nearby schools. You have people across the country, families wondering, are my kids going to come home tonight after school? And kids wondering, could this happen here? And I wonder, does that sort of fall into your recommendation that teachers and parents too need to be talking with their children and allowing them to express these things rather than, no, I'm sorry, we've got to get onto math instruction, or we've got to talk about social studies because we got a lot of ground to cover.
And so this is something that any teacher, any parent can do right away without the need for resources, because it's, responding to a situation that's happened. It needs to be talked about. There need to be spaces where, and so if you're a parent, you're communicating with your child, asking, how are you feeling about this? Let's talk about the experience. If they don't want to talk about it, keep trying, keep providing opportunities, keep bringing it up, keep finding ways. What, if you don't want to talk to me, is there someone else you want to talk to? And then if you're a teacher, absolutely. If we don't address the experience and help students process the trauma around it and talk through it, this is going to weigh on all of these students' minds, of course, because it's terrifying. And that then compounds, and based on, depending on what other things are going on in their lives, this is the kind of thing that ultimately builds up and builds up and builds up. And it then impacts them in so many ways, academics being one of them. How can you possibly concentrate on learning when you're terrified, or when you're traumatized, or when you're overwhelmed, or when, you're confused? You can't. And so creating spaces to really connect to how does this make me feel? How can I understand this? This is another really important point. How can I understand why this might happen? Because if we don't talk about why for people that have experienced this, it becomes this big, scary unknown. And it's true that this could happen at any moment, but if you really have a bit more of an understanding of the circumstances that leads to this, it becomes less of a big, scary monster on the bed and more of a, okay, this is something that we can't control, but we can do something about it. And that is, I think, the most important thing that any of us can do as a response to this, especially people that are immediately affected. Help young people use this experience as an opportunity to do something positive. So, expressing the feelings around it is one thing, and then saying, okay, in the name of those people that we lost, we want to now set something up at our school where we talk about mental health, and we don't let we don't let these things, we don't let a kid get into a situation where they feel that way. We want to do something about it. And that is the way that you can turn this tragedy into, finding some glimmer of positivity in the midst of all that pain.
Boy, I think it's so important to hear what you just said, because I could imagine the impulse among some in reaction to this is, and very well-intended peoples, we're not going to talk about this because all it does is throw salt into the wound and the fear. Let's just move on. We're not going to spend time discussing why it might have happened, because it just makes it worse. But what you're saying is the opposite. Yeah, it doesn't go away. It's still in there. And if it,
I mean, it's like, you have a rash on your skin. and you go, okay, I'm just going to cover it up with makeup, and that'll that'll be the solution,
Uh-huh.
and then I won't see it anymore and it'll be fine. Sure, that might help in the moment and you don't see it, but then you don't know what caused the rash, and so it's probably going to get worse. It's probably going to come out in other ways. And so it's about getting to the root of, well, why do I have this rash in the first place? It's the same thing. So physical health and mental health really operate the same way. If we ask the why question, it feel uncomfortable. It does hurt in the moment. It is easier to just put a lid on it in some senses and not talk about it. But what are the long-term implications of that? Every single person that has faced, this experience and been impacted by this experience has a ripple effect of that trauma. And so if we can help to process it, then that can turn into something, again, that they do in a positive way for themselves or their community. Whereas if we don't talk about it, it's just going to fester. It's just going to stay inside, become a fear, become a rage, become all of these normal emotions that if they don't have a place to come out, they just get trapped, and then they come out in other unhelpful ways later.
There's another group that we sometimes forget about when problems in our society are challenging, is we ask teachers to do something about it. We forget that teachers themselves, in cases like this, are traumatized. They're thinking, I mean, what teacher is not out there thinking, my goodness, what would this be like if this happened to me or to my school, and the trauma that must. So, and then of course there are parents, and it just makes me think that one of the things that school officials might consider doing is pulling teachers together and saying, how are you doing? What are you feeling? What are your fears? And that being one. And then the thing we do less often, and sometimes never, is to invite parents in and say, we're here tonight. We brought food. We have to believe that some of you are concerned and are feeling things, both empathizing with the families and students there, but also worried. And we've just invited you in to allow you to share those feelings with each other.
That's beautiful. It's so, so important, and it's amazing if schools can do that. And I know it's so hard for schools to do initiatives like that because there's, the burden of time and the burden of resources and all those things, but it's so valuable. I would encourage that of any school across the country, just exactly what you just described. And it's not about, we don't have a magic solution to this, unfortunately. There's no matter how many, and it's important, absolutely, that we have layers of security, those buttons that they had the teachers pressing, genius, all of these things, really, really great. This is important. But also we have to recognize that this is not something we can control. And so we also have to deal with the emotional element of it, because it can be really easy when you get a group of people together, everyone's just focused on who can we blame and how can we make sure that this never happens again. We should be absolutely asking those questions, but still remembering that we can't control the outcome because this is the world that we live in. And so how do we also deal with the emotional side of it? How do we, and just like you said, express the horror, the devastation, the fear, and how do we come together and support each other as a community? And really, most importantly, how do we support our teachers? Because that is terrifying. The idea that you will show up at your job that you love, that you're passionate about, and you might not come home. That is very scary. And so how do we build in those extra levels of support that are so necessary for teachers? Because if they don't feel supported, they're doing the most important job, raising our children, teaching our children. How do we make sure that they have that support and feel supported and have that connection and community to know that we're all behind them?
With that, Haley, I just want to thank you again for coming back and helping us understand this incredibly difficult situation that once again and all too frequently has happened. And I think we're all looking for ways to respond, to help families, to help children, to help ourselves, to help our communities, both prevent these things from happening in the first place and how to support one another when it does happen. And it's such an important thing to be doing. And a huge takeaway from me is from what you said is that we have to be talking with each other. We have to be listening to each other. We can't sweep it under the rug. We can't put makeup on the rash and expect and hope that it will just go away, because in the long term, it's going to come back and it's going to hurt us.
And I just want to end with one final thing, if I may, in terms of if you're a parent or a teacher listening and thinking, how do I have this conversation? Just a really simple guiding point for you is just asking about feelings and then letting any feeling be okay. If your child or a student is sad, is angry, is scared, is numb, any of those things, there's no right or wrong. So it's just saying, how is this making you feel? And then it's okay that you're feeling that way. That's normal. It's, and just validating that. And that's a really simple pointer that can go such a long way of just that piece of students feeling heard and feeling like their reality is validated, and knowing that while we can't make it all go away, we're together in it, and we are supported, and they're not alone in their experience. So thank you so much for having me. And I really, really appreciate you speaking about such an important topic.
Yeah, Haley, thank you again so much. Well, for our listeners out there, you can find this episode and my previous interview with Dr. Watson and all of our episodes at schoolconversations.org and wherever you listen to your podcasts. Bye, everyone.